What's up guys, hello, so Footballtalk here. Welcome back to a second part of the biggest remaining needs on every NFL roster series for 2022. If you haven't checked it out yet, the video on the NFC will pop up at the very end, and of course you can start there if you like. In this video we'll be focusing on the AFC, talk about the one area that each team should still be looking to invest into now that all the big trades, the draft, and the majority of free agency are in the books. Like I said in the NFC video, I originally wanted to focus on the piece or player that is still missing for each team, but I quickly switched to more of a run through of some of the moves that were made, how it led me to writing down the mentioned position, and what it would or could do for each team. Timestamps for each division can be found down below, as well as the link to my page hellosforfootballtalk.com, where I recently put out a piece on the most improved position groups this offseason. Truly one of the best things I've ever written, I believe. And you can also find my social media handles down there if you want to stay up to date with all the content that I post. But I don't want to make this intro even longer than the first one, so let me quickly mention that this isn't necessarily the biggest area of improvement possible, because if you put an MVP quarterback on almost any other team, they're gonna be a lot better of course, but rather this is about the one area that stuck out to me as a spot where they could still be using some reinforcements. This could be a starter, key rotational piece, specialist, or just general depth being added at a certain position. At this point I should also note that I recorded this a good week in advance, just in case some moves happened since then, and that already brings us to the first division here, the AFC North, where the first team up, the Baltimore Ravens, I put on speed wideout. Even if the biggest priority for Baltimore is still getting Lamar Jackson on the contract, I'd argue, and the whole situation has been rather weird. Yet the rest of the offseason has been pretty impressive, looking at some of the cheap veteran deals that they were able to put together to offset some of the losses that they suffered on either side of the football, along with bringing back Calais Campbell and making safety Marcus Williams the big free agency signing. That's all before putting together one of the best draft classes out there once again, making several plus value selections throughout 3 days. With that being said, even if I'd certainly argue that they came away with the better end of the transaction, they did trade one of the established players at a position that wasn't a huge strength for them anyway, when they basically swapped wide receiver Marquise Brown for the 23rd overall pick that they got from the Arizona Cardinals, and then they didn't use any of the selections that they owned or looked for a single player in free agency to counterbalance that. Even though Peter King said about 2 months ago that they were about to draft Memphis wide receiver Calvin Austin III with one of the 4th round picks before the rivals in the Steelers snatched them up one spot earlier, that would have definitely made things easier here. I expect a major second year breakout campaign from Rashad Bateman, who was my clear wide receiver 4 in last year's draft, behind the trio of Jamar Chase, Jalen Waddle and Devontae Smith. But without a single receiver being brought in, they don't have a guy with that kind of skill set that Hollywood brought to the table for them, with that speed in the perimeter. Brown had his issues working through contact and stacking corners on vertical routes, but putting him off the line, he could blow by some people. Kevin Duvernay has track speed, but is better suited for a slot and as a return specialist, while James Prochet, Talon Wallace and Benjamin Victor are all not cracking mid-4.5s. Whether they want defenses to respect the trip side and give those one-on-one matchups with Bateman at X, or moving into the slot and not allow teams to bracket him, even if you don't target that type of player a whole lot, you simply need the threat. Also to not allow defenses to creep up against the heavy run packages, because you may get somebody behind them. That I think will be key for them, how the defense has to play them. Then we got the Cincinnati Bengals, and for them I put on return specialist. While you can argue that the Bengals overachieved last season, going all the way to the big game, and people seem to forget that they went 10-7 throughout the regular season, I believe they actually addressed by far the biggest area of weakness in a smart way, adding several mid-level free agents to the offensive line to just have that solid group of 5 up front, while adding some more talent in the secondary via the draft. So there's not much to question the roster now, I'd say. They did lose some depth on the interior defensive line, but also added a couple of names there. So once again, this isn't a major need in terms of an every down starter on offense or defense, but rather a specialist who can help both sides of the football with positive field positioning and deliver some big plays in that first facet of the game, similar to what rookie kicker Evan McPherson did for them during the playoff run, where he banged them some long kicks in crucial situations and helped them bring in those W's. Every player to return a kick for the Bengals last season finished the year with an average PER of below 22.5, with then rookie running back Chris Evans being the exception, who also delivered some splash plays on offense as a passing down specialist, scoring on 5 of 32 offensive touches that he had, while punt return duties are all kinda up for grabs, with Darius Phillips having moved on to Las Vegas, who fielded 25 of 36 punts, and he was also the second in kick returns. Second in terms of punts was Trent Taylor, and he should be the favorite for the role along with Evans, because he's sure-handed and gets some positive yardage, but it's far from a game breaker. I'd figure Evans will be a little more involved heavily into the offense and will only take one of those two duties, so at least the other one, I could see a guy who delivers some big plays in that regard be a quality addition for them. Then we get to the Cleveland Browns, and I put down backup guard for them. Outside of the mess that the whole Deshaun Watson situation has created, where nobody can really know what's going to happen with the suspension and just the PR nightmare that he's bringing along with him, looking at the lineup of the Browns, there are 3 areas that I have some questions about. I thought they might add a big body in the middle of the defensive line, since they lost the starting duo from Malik Jackson and Malik McDowell. So either they play Jordan Elliott more in the A-gaps, or Tommy Togiai takes on a more prominent role in year 2. The second position I was thinking about was wide receiver, since they did trade for Amari Cooper as the number 1, Donovan Peoples-Jones double his production in year 2, and I do like third round pick David Bell as a guy who's ready to produce thanks to savvy play, but they don't necessarily have that speed Z receiver to stretch defenses vertically. However, I ultimately sell on backup guard, because while the front 5 figures to be as good as any other group in the league, as long as Nick Harris can step in sufficiently for JC Treader at the pivot, and I was a big fan of his as a draft steal last year, the depth on the interior is a big question mark for me. Ethan Posick figures to be the primary backup center, and can line up at guard, but is not really somebody who you want bearing defense as a puller or drive people off the line in combos. Chris Hubbard should be a solid backup at those 2 tackle spots, but once you look beyond that, it gets pretty thin, with names like Michael Dunn, David Moore, Drew Forbes, Hjalti Froholt, and they see a 7th round pick Dawson Deaton competing for the final roster spot. Those 2 guards for Cleveland are the big strength in terms of roster unit wise, and if either one gets injured, you don't want a huge step backwards, so I think investing into a solid replacement when needed would be a key move for them. And finally, the Pittsburgh Steelers, we stay on the offensive line with left tackle. There are certainly some concerns with the Steelers defense, with the sudden retirement of Stephon Tuitt in particular, who they certainly missed in run defense particularly last season, as they ranked dead last in yards allowed per rush and 20-yard runs allowed by a wide margin. Miles Jack being brought in could bring a severe upgrade at the second level, but his health is a major question mark, and the corner room leaves things to be desired, even if the system is heavily based on zone coverage that doesn't demand great play on the perimeter. However, while there are some kinks in the armor, it's the offense that has been a question mark for multiple years now. Quarterback play is a piece that obviously we're unsure about at this point, with Mitchell Trubisky trying to restart his career in Pittsburgh, while they also brought in the guy who walked through the door on the other side of the facility for 5 years in Pitt's Kenny Pickett as the 24th overall pick. Yet with how lackluster the play of Big Ben has been recently, and how he's limited the offense, this at least shouldn't be a downgrade theoretically. With that being said, whoever will be at the helm will be playing behind a still very much questionable offensive line. The Steelers did invest in some mid-round draft picks the last couple of years, but other than Kevin Dotson, none of those have really established themselves as average or above average starters, while James Daniels was the one addition that they made in free agency to help out, bring some flexibility to the interior. However, they lost both their starting tackles last year, and while I believe Chuck Okorafor can be a solid starter if he cleans up his penalties, the designated left tackle Dan Moore Jr. to me was more of a backup, evaluating him for last year's draft class already as a mid-round pick, and he allowed 6.5 sacks as a 16-game starter. The options behind him are Joe Haig, Chaz Green, and maybe undrafted free agent Jordan Tucker, who I liked as a backup coming out of UNC, just altogether not very inspiring. Leading us to the second division here, the AFC East, where once again we start with the letter B in the Buffalo Bills. There's a reason the Bills are the current Super Bowl favorites, looking at Josh Allen having turned himself into one of the truly elite quarterbacks, all the weapons that they've put around him, also including a dynamic two-way play in former Georgia running back James Cook as the second round pick, and one of the better pass protecting offensive line, along with a defense that is as well coached as any other in the league, with the addition of free agent edge rusher Von Miller and first round pick Elam at cornerback. A big reason for their recent success has been the fact that they've had one of the previous safety tandems in football for the last few years, between Jordan Poyer and Micah Hyde. However, if I had to point out one area where they could be highly vulnerable to injury, it would be one of those two spots. Those two guys I just mentioned played 91 and 95% of the defensive snaps last season respectively, while the next closest guy was Tyron Neal, who was a core special teamer for them and used as a big nickel to some degree, but he only played 14% of defensive snaps. Beyond that, you're looking at Jaquan Johnson and DeMar Hamlin, who combined for about another 14% of defensive snaps, and that's understandable with how well coordinated that starting duo is, and how much the Bills are nickel personnel, as the slot corner Teron Johnson isn't far behind them in playing time. But that doesn't mean that they're immune to injury, and bound to see the defense have a major drop-off if they were to suffer the loss of either one of those two guys, who are pretty interchangeable for them in terms of skill set. Finding a complete number 3 safety would be crucial for their chances of going all the way, because we saw last season with Trey White to some degree what one injury to the secondary can do once they face the elite aerial attacks around the league. Then we got the Miami Dolphins, and this one I'll have to explain a little bit more here. I listed penetrating defensive tackle. It wasn't easy to find a true need on Miami's roster in terms of a spot that really sticks out in a negative way. The offensive line is still a question mark outside of the signing of Pro Bowl left tackle Teron Armstead, but they've invested a bunch of pieces to put the front five together and have much improved play there. So with Mike McDaniel implementing the Shanahan-style offense and the addition of the explosive Tyreek Hill, Tua Tagovailoa has all the elements around him to prove that he's the guy for the Fins. Defensively, they retained coordinator Josh Boyer. They might have the exact same 11 starter from a year ago, other than maybe one of the linebacker spots being filled with the guy that they drafted in the third round. So there's nothing missing in terms of a general sense, but I believe they could add another element to their front on defense to make them tougher to deal with. Miami molded or beefed up Raekwon Davis into a pretty movable object at nose tackle, but other than Christian Wilkins, all the other bodies that they have there on that unit also more so space eaters like Adam Butler, John Jenkins, and Zach Sealer. With how they deploy their personnel, particularly looking at the heavy pressure packages in designated passing situations, where it's more about getting a free runner and creating those one-on-ones for the edge rushers, but I think they could use another more penetrating piece on the interior. Offenses that run a lot of 11 personnel may force them to play with those 2 interior defensive linemen, of which one is kind of a non-factor in terms of playing upfield, while you want Christian Wilkins to also stay fresh. So I would suggest adding another player who can line up on the edges of the guard or center and attack upfield to create issues for teams that want to use a lot of lateral run schemes and take deeper pass sets in early downs. Next we got the New England Patriots, and I want to talk about the backup tackle situation. New England's season took a major turn late last season, losing 3 of the final 4 regular season matchups by at least 9 points, before the Bills just blew them out in the wildcard round by 30 points. And the big reason for that is that they simply lack true playmakers on either side of the football. For such a long time, they've been so well coached and maximized the skill sets of the players that they brought in, that they were able to play better football overall than their opponents. But this brings us to a more general discussion about how you need difference makers these days, rather than just play great team football, which will go beyond the parameters of this discussion, and so I'm gonna keep going here. As far as obvious holes, there's nothing in the starting lineup that really jumps out to me. However, as I look through the second string names, the backup players on the offensive line looked extremely bare before the draft. And then 6th round pick Jason Hines from LSU to me is a pure guard, and 7th rounder Andrew Stuber did play right tackle at Michigan, but I don't believe he has the foot quickness or lateral agility to stay out there as much as they want to run power, ISO, and all those kind of gap schemes, or at least have done traditionally. In particular, I believe with the draft class they put together, I'd expect the offense to be based around a lot more perimeter-oriented run schemes, which I wouldn't trust either one of those guys that they have there at the tackle spot in Justin Hearn or Yannick Juiced, once again illustrating that they could be in major trouble if either one of those tackles were to miss time, which with Trent Brown is to be expected, looking at his recent medical history. Even with the understanding of how the Patriots want to use the offensive line, how good they are at adapting to personnel losses, they could be one injury away from being royally screwed there, particularly without the expertise of Josh McDaniels as offensive coordinator, or offensive line coach Dante Scarnecchia for such a long time. Finally for the East here, the New York Jets, a listed strong side or Sam linebacker, a team whose direction I'm a lot more excited about heading into 2022, as the Jets put together one of the best draft classes league-wide and paired it up with a couple of key veteran additions, such as Pro Bowl guard Laken Tomlinson, cornerback DJ Reed, and a new starting safety tandem most likely. The success this year will largely rely upon the jump the quarterback Zach Wilson can make in year 2, looking at the pieces they've put around him, opponents not being as comfortable with playing heavy man, puts against him because those receivers wouldn't break open, and another full offseason to mature in a complicated, wordy playbook from Mike LaFleur, while the defense all of a sudden should see a huge upgrade on the edges and in the secondary. The one spot as I look at the starting 11 on that side of the ball, where I still have my concerns, is that third linebacker job, particularly on the strong side of the formation. A.J. Mosley hasn't been able to live up to that then market-setting deal that he signed with Gang Green 3 years ago, simply because he's only played 18 games since then, and didn't particularly play well last season. But neither did really anybody on the defense, and I'd expect a bounce back with such improved surrounding pieces. Quincy Williams played about 3/4 of the snaps for them defensively last season, and looks to be a bargain waiver signing as a run chase player who needs to work on knocking over his skis as a tackler, but that third spot in base, which Sherrod Davis filled a year ago, is still an unknown. Not saying that that's a true starter at this point anymore, playing a third of defensive snaps at best, but looking at the converted safeties and dime linebackers that are on this roster, in Hamza Nasirildeen and Jamin Sherwood, those are not the types of players that they need for a role. Last season they allowed an NFL high 28 rushing touchdowns, and they were one of the worst teams defending short yardage runs, with a 72% success rate against them on runs on 3rd and 3 or less. I'm not worried about the ability to match Titans and backs in coverage, but rather defending heavy personnel when they can't stay in nickel, without a true nose tackle on the roster, as Fuller Ronso Fatukasi signed a free agent deal with Jacksonville. Now we get to a third division here, the AFC South, where the first team up is the Houston Texans, and for them I put down deep post safety. Quarterback is obviously an area where they are evaluating Davis Mills in year 2, if he can be the future option, and they'll need some young pass catch-ups to step up around him, along with the often underrated Brandon Cooks. But defense is where they have more question marks to be answered, still having some leftovers from the Bill O'Brien regime, and guys that may not traditionally fit in a Lovie Smith defense necessarily. I already thought they should invest into that second safety alongside Justin Reed a year ago, but now he's even gone. And Eric Murray's snap total decreased from 98 to 70% this past season, so it's not like they have any proven commodities that they want to keep in the role necessarily. It will be interesting to see how to deploy the personnel in the slot between veteran Desmond King and one of the second round picks Jalen Petrie from Baylor, who excelled in college and Dave Miranda's star role as a designated nickel defender. I could see him be used more as a high safety if they deploy more quarters elements, which would also coincide with the selection of third overall pick Derek Stilling Jr. from LSU, so they can have him in quasi one-on-one on the X receiver, particularly in trip sets. Still, if they want to make those split safety looks work, they can't always stay in those two high shells, but rather rotate the safeties and put somebody in the deep post who can legitimately cover ground and take away shots down the middle. Terrence Brooks and Jonathan Owens were on the field for about 15% of the defensive snaps respectively last season, but neither one of those really fit the bill and should be used as a designated starting option. I like what they've done with the transition of their front and the two pieces that they added in the secondary via the draft, but they'll be limited in what they can do if they don't acquire a rangy safety on the deep end to provide them the possibility to be versatile. Next up, the Indianapolis Colts, and I'll list the number 2 cornerback. Man, you can really talk yourself into the Colts as a contender this year, and we see it reflect in the betting market, where they've separated themselves as a favorite for the division. Leading up to the 2 final games of last season, they had won 6 of the prior 7 games, with a bit of a late collapse against the Bucs in between those. The play of Carson Wentz was the biggest reason that they weren't able to bring it home, and suffered an embarrassing loss to Jacksonville to keep them out of the playoffs. That's why they moved on from him this offseason and took advantage of the opportunity to bring Matt Ryan for a third round pick. They followed that up by putting together an impressive draft class and then bringing in former Defensive Player of the Year Stephon Gilmore, looking to re-establish himself at least as a plus starter. However, I'm not really sold at whoever's going to be his running mate. You can certainly argue that right guard is a position of uncertainty, but at least guys like Danny Pinta and Matt Pryor have provided solid play for limited stretches. So instead I want to focus on the second guy on the perimeter defensively, where they traded Rock Ya-Sin straight up for defensive end Yannick Ngakoue, and Xavier Rhodes wasn't re-signed, which was to be expected. Isaiah Rodgers replaced the veteran last season, playing 40% of snaps and performing fairly well, but I think there's certainly room for improvement. Brendan Faison is a guy who can give them some solid snaps as a number 3 corner and spot starter as well, so this tells you it's not a major hole, with the safety that they brought in recently and the unwillingness new defensive coordinator Gus Bradley has shown before to adapt to the modern NFL. We could see him implement more single high safety structures, which puts more stress than on your corners. So with how offensive play callers excel creating those positive matchups for the top receivers, that may end up being a spot that they'll attack, and therefore Indy needs to protect themselves. Leading us to the Jacksonville Jaguars, and I put on kicker for them. This may not seem like the most glaring area for a team that just picked first overall in the draft in back-to-back years, but Jacksonville simply has added so many names via free agency, where you can certainly argue that they overpaid for too many of those guys, and the draft, that we have to somewhat give those guys the benefit of the doubt here. Not that they are necessarily household names, even though their new salaries may suggest so, but adding Christian Kirk, Evan Ingram, and Zay Jones without any other loss in the receiving corps is certainly an upgrade. They signed the top guard in the free agency market in Brandon Scherf. They added established, mostly underrated players at all 3 levels of the defense, and invested heavily into that side of the ball during the draft. So while they need Andre Sisco to step up in year 2 at safety, for a position group that isn't super impressive, he graded out very well for me coming out of Syracuse a year ago, and I want to see him in a more prominent role, so instead I'm actually going to focus on special teams here. I could bring in a pretty lame joke here when I say the Jags not only lost the starting kicker to begin the 2021 season with in Josh Lambo, but also the more famous kicker on the roster last year in Urban Meyer. But I'm going to focus on the names that are actually there now. Ryan Santoso will be on his 4th team in 3 seasons as a pro. While not finding a home during the 2020 campaign, he's made 4 or 5 field goals and 6 of 8 PATs in his career, but wasn't able to stick on either the Panthers or Lions last year, despite the fact that they were going through 3 and 4 kickers themselves respectively. And then there's undrafted free agent Andrew Mevis, who had a pretty solid year kicking and punting at Iowa State, but obviously has no track record in the NFL. So to get somebody to give your second-year quarterback Trevor Lawrence and the offense as a whole confidence, when you're able to drive down the field and convert into points, and do so from longer range as well, would be huge for this young group. Therefore, if neither guy really shows out in camp, they may at least want to bring in some other names and try to earn this job. Last but certainly not least for the South here, the Tennessee Titans. I listed interior offensive line depth. As for the AFC's reigning number 1 seed, they certainly feel like the forgotten team this offseason, considering they are now significantly behind the Colts in terms of betting odds to win the South, and just nobody seems to talk about them. The biggest reason for that is the fact that they traded star wide receiver A.J. Brown to Philadelphia in exchange for a top 20 draft pick, which they used sort of on his direct replacement in Arkansas' Treylon Burks, who presents similar qualities in terms of physical receiver who can win through contact with and without the football, as well as having that extra gear to pull away from the defense more often than not. But he's certainly not the quality player that Brown is at this stage of their careers. Other than that, people seem to forget that they only really lost left guard Roger Saffold and veteran wide receiver Julio Jones from the starting lineup, which the latter was only available for sporadically anyway. They still have a lot of studs on defense, a pretty damn good coaching staff, and a quarterback who I believe has a baseline of at least being a league average starter. However, where I am buying what the sportsbook and the general NFL media are selling about this team is that when you look at the depth chart, the roster is paper thin. Other than maybe slot defender, if you want to classify it that way, there's not a single position where I would argue that they are set up particularly well to sustain any injury. That includes the offensive line, where the selection of Ohio State tackle Nicholas Petit-Frere makes things interesting with where they put Dylan Reduce in his second season, either at right tackle or moving to left guard and slide the rookie into the right side. If they stick with Reduce at right tackle, you can certainly argue Aaron Brewer at left guard is a weak spot for them. However, I would say that the depth on the interior is actually the most concerning area, since if Brewer starts, we're looking at Jamarco Jones, who's better suited on the edge but can play guard, Corey Levin and Daniel Munyer, who both haven't started a game since 2018. With the way that they want to run the football and center Ben Jones moving towards the tail end of his career, that's not a recipe for success. Which brings us to a final division of this breakdown, the AFC West. First up, the Denver Broncos. For them, I listed inside linebacker. First and foremost, I'm excited to see what this Broncos roster can do now that they have competent quarterback play. While I can certainly argue that the surrounding pieces have been a little bit better in recent years, particularly considering that they had to give up impact players on both sides of the football in that trade for Russ Wilson, there's not much missing on the roster to make some noise in a division where they finished in 4th last season. In terms of areas where they could still use upgrades, right tackle is the one on offense where they're probably going to have a replacement level starter, and they need somebody to step up next to free agency addition DJ Jones on the defensive interior. However, the one spot I think they are truly vulnerable at is inside linebacker. The starting duo from a year ago in Alexander Johnson and then Kenny Young over the second half of the year, once he was traded over from the Rams, both are not resigned. They did bring back Josie Jewell on a 2-year, $11 million contract, who started every game in 2020 and then was hurt 2 games into this past season. But then you're looking at Alex Singleton, who has been a productive player for the Eagles in terms of tackling numbers, but particularly last season, that was more volume stats than mass stop per play. And one of the teams with serious linebacker issues coming into the offseason let him walk to sign a 1-year deal for just over $1 million. Justin Sternett and Jonas Griffith played about 29 and 23% of snaps respectively last year's backups, while the one guy I'm still intrigued by is last year's late third round pick Baron Browning from Ohio State. He ended up playing about 60% of snaps, but in more of an experimental role I would say, spending time on the edge early on. He's a pretty crazy athlete who can cover plenty of ground at about 250 pounds, but they may want to use him as a pressure play on passing downs, and Jewell isn't necessarily somebody you want to match up one-on-one with guys out of the backfield. I would not rule out Denver still re-signing Alexander Johnson, but right now that group is more of an unknown. Bringing us to the Kansas City Chiefs, who have won the division for 5 or 6 straight years now, For them, I listed backup 3 technique. It's kind of funny how nobody seems to be talking about the Chiefs this offseason, when all they lost from a year ago in terms of true impact players are Tyreek Hill, who they got plenty of draft capital for in return, before having to give him his big extension, and 2 pieces in the secondary with Tyrann Mathieu and Javarius Ward, who they found some promising potential replacement for with those draft picks that I just mentioned. The rest of the roster is still pretty damn good, and they have a chance to actually be a more complete team, I believe. There's no one guy maybe in the league to recreate what Tyreek Hill was for them, but with the likely new starting trio, as I see it right now, might be better as a group actually, while the signing of Justin Reed, in terms of just on-field play, maybe a wash with Honey Badger, and they added a bunch of corners in the draft. Of starters, I don't really see a major hole for them, so I'm more focused on whether they're least protected against injury, or could use some more bodies to keep their star players fresh. And the one guy I ended up with is the backup to Chris Jones, so to speak, and D-line depth in general, you can argue. The primary backup on the interior, Jarran Reed, and one of the top 2 names on the edge in Alex Okafor, and not on the roster anymore. Mike Dana has given them some okay play as an inside-out player, and Deshaun Wharton is a solid backup to Derek Nnadi as a run-stuffing shade nose. I don't see anybody even remotely close to the penetration element that Chris Jones provides, without Reed there now, who they also play together on passing downs quite a bit. Their second pick in the first round, George Kalafdis, has the body type to reduce inside in those situations, but unless they pull down one of the linebackers to the edge, there's not much of a threat to replace him there either, so they can use somebody else there to at least create some chaos. Next up, the Las Vegas Raiders, and for them I wrote down speed wide receiver, and this was another one that doesn't just scream out to me, which tells you how good this division could be in 2022, after coming a long field goal in overtime by these Raiders short of sending 3 teams to the playoffs. You can certainly question if Jonathan Abrams should be on the field for nearly 1,000 defensive snaps when his play is below average even in Gus Bradley's cover 3 heavy scheme that is looking more antiquated by the day if you follow trends around the league, but should fit him best personally, and they're still looking for answers as to how exactly to construct the offensive line with some versatile pieces that they can plug into different spots, but they have young players that I do like there. He was arguably one of the most improved position groups in the league for them, purely based on the addition of Davante Adams in a trade with Green Bay, who is largely accepted as one of the top 2 receivers today. Hunter Renfrow has a PhD in route running from the slot, and Darren Waller is somebody who can be moved all over the formation with the gliding speed to legitimately win on the perimeter. However, while he will be used flexed out as a coverage indicator for new head coach Josh McDaniels, they could use another speed element on that offense. DeMarcus Robinson figures to take on a more prominent role coming over from the division rival in the Chiefs, but there's a reason he just recorded his lowest receiving total since 2017. So among the likely top 5 targets, if you throw running back Josh Jacobs into the mix, the only one maybe clearing the 4-5 in the 40 at this point might be the guy tagged as a tight end. Mac Hollins can be a designated deep route guy along with what he brings you on special teams, and maybe Keelan Cole is a thing again with competent quarterback play finally. But I think if they had somebody out at flanker who can legitimately threaten the defense stemming vertically and change how teams have to play what figures to be in what 12 and 21 personnel heavy team, that would only help out everybody else. And the final team of the entire breakdown, the Los Angeles Chargers, which I actually put on 2 positions, left guard / right tackle, which I'll explain in a second here. If there's one team that can be labeled most improved or whatever you want to call it, the Chargers are certainly in the running for that title, and we've seen a lot of those so-called super teams collapse and not take advantage of all the talent on the roster, looking at some of the precedents. But if you consider what they already had in place and the areas that they did invest into, there's a lot of reason for optimism. Particularly on defense, JC Jackson gives them a legitimate boundary corner who can play quasi-man on the opposing team's top receiver, even if they are in quarters theoretically. And Khalil Mack plus Joey Bosa now make things very tough to slide the protection a certain way, with the stress that both those guys can put on tackles. However, the biggest area of improvement for this group to me is the interior defensive line, where they routinely got smashed in the run game because of the box looks that they presented to their opponents, and them not having the bodies to actually win those gaps back. I actually wrote about this in my most recent article, if you're interested in front mechanics and how it affects what they can do in the back end. So considering Brandon Staley coordinated the league's #1 defense with the other LA team, with arguably an even or better talent level outside of Aaron Donald, I expect major improvement from that unit. So my focus is almost purely on the offensive side of the ball, where they need to do a better job of maximizing the talent of quarterback Justin Herbert, instead of kind of boxing him in like he was at Oregon, where under Michael Lombardi you see a ton of quick game and Herbert not being allowed to push the ball down the field regularly enough. That's why I thought Ohio State's Chris Olave in the first round of the draft would be a perfect vertical element at Z for them, but with 5 receivers already off the board at the point that they got on the clock, they now need Jalen Guyton to step up in that role. The real concerning spot on offense is dependent on where they want to put Matt Fowler, who had an excellent season at left guard last year, but may want to move back to right tackle, but he was a solid starter for the Steelers for a while. Personally, I don't think you can charge Storm Norton at right tackle again, who Pro Football Focus charged with 9 sacks and 6 penalties surrendered last year, and Trey Pipkins couldn't even win the job against him. The interior should now be fortified with one of the cleanest guard prospects in a few years being brought in, 17th overall in the draft, with Boston College's Zion Johnson. So having Brandon Kaimis or maybe even 6th round pick Jamar Salia at that other guard spot makes some sense for me, but either way, they could use another veteran there. And that also wraps up the AFC edition of this series. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet, because why else will you still be here at this point otherwise? And feel free to share this with a couple of friends who might enjoy this kind of detailed NFL content. As always, the link to my page on Footballtalk.com can be found in the video description, where you can get to all my videos and articles that I post. My social media handles are down below as well if you want to know whenever I post for even more content, and just if you want to further support me. If you haven't done so yet, make sure to also listen to the NFC video. My divisional draft breakdown series is on here as well, where I analyze all 262 draft prospects and how they fit with a new team, analyze how this coincides with the other roster moves we've seen, and compare those classes against each other inside each division. Hopefully that should already pop up any second here in the top right corner. And as I already referenced a couple of times, I also put out a piece on the most improved position groups this offseason that can be found on my page. Next up will be another in-depth write-up, where I rank the 8 teams that finished last inside each division this past season by likelihood of winning it this year. I had a lot of fun trying to lay out the path for that happening, and even more so, finding flaws with the 3 other teams. Be on the lookout for that one. So until then, see you later. Peace!